Hi there, this is Jim from Trek World. Join me today as we look back on yet another of the overlooked but incredibly talented people whose work literally shaped our very lives. So, if you've been a fan since day one, sit back and prepare for a fond remembrance of an old friend. However, if your Trek journey began much later, then please pull up a chair as we introduce you to someone who was long gone before you even became a fan. You may be quite surprised to see just how much of the Trek you love was a result of his work.
The following program is brought to you in living color on NBC.
Now, they say that when you go, it doesn't matter what you take, it's what you leave behind. With this video, Gene Coon becomes the very first person to be inducted in Trek World's Hall of Fame. This particular playlist is going to be dedicated to the fallen heroes of Star Trek that most fans will never be aware of. It's my hope that that playlist and the videos within it will always serve as a reference that people can stumble on in the future when they want to know not just what this person did for Star Trek, but more importantly, what kind of person were they? What were their other personality traits, hobbies, endeavors? The Klingon Empire, and their sworn 23rd century foe, Starfleet Command, which was the peacekeeping and exploration arm of the United Federation of Planets. The Organians and their imposed cessation of hostilities between the Klingons and the Federation, an ingenious plot solution which allowed for a classic Axis and Allies competitiveness without dragging the entire TV series into a war, thus allowing the show to still focus on its theme of exploration. The Universal Translator, which allowed the crew of the Enterprise to speak to aliens without ever having to know their language. From the deepest depths of Khan Noonien Singh and the Eugenics Wars, to the incredible heights of Zefram Cochrane and the discovery of the warp drive. And towering above it all, Starfleet's Prime Directive. Gene was responsible for each and every one of these concepts. Well, this is this is kind of awkward. It seems I might have been a little careless in my setup for this. That is a photo of Gene, but not the right Gene. There now. That is much better. Let me set the stage for where our story begins. 1 month before the show's premiere, Gene Roddenberry took a vacation. His producer just walked out on him, so he hired television veteran Gene L. Coon, an ex-Marine. To a very large degree, Coon was going to be the one who would definitely fill the show's creativity in the coming months. The Star Trek that has imprinted itself on fans for decades is Gene L. Coon's. His shows deepened the relationships between Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, and Dr. McCoy. He created the Klingons. There was more humor with him. David Gerald said Gene L. Coon created the noble image that everyone gives Roddenberry the most credit for. Bill Shatner put it this way: Gene Coon had more to do with the infusion of life into Star Trek than any other single person. So as I said, Gene Roddenberry hired Gene Coon in August of 1966 to contribute stories and help oversee Trek's production after John D.F. Black quit the series in frustration from working with Roddenberry. This exodus was to be the first in a series that would stretch out over, believe it or not, the next 20 years into Star Trek The Next Generation. As much as everybody loved Gene Roddenberry's vision, working closely with him always resulted in a badly fractured relationship. Now, Gene worked full-time on Star Trek from the first season episode Miri to the second season's episode A Private Little War, and he would go on to contribute periodically for the third season under the pseudonym Lee Cronin. Now, like John D.F. Black before him, he left the show in the second season due to exhaustion and to personal clashes with Roddenberry over how Coon regularly interjected the show with comedy and light-hearted banter. During his tenure, he would contribute more writing, outlines, and rewrites than any other person other than Gene Roddenberry. So now let's take a look at the 13 actual episodes that Coon either wrote, rewrote, or co-wrote. Now, in the episode Arena, the Federation was first revealed. Gene L. Coon wrote the script at the last minute, over a weekend, to be ready to shoot on Monday morning. This kind of weekend writing spree was commonplace for Gene while he was there. Now, apparently, an almost identical story had been printed over 20 years before in Astounding Science Fiction magazine. A lifelong science fiction addict, Gene had apparently read that story and didn't realize that his story so closely followed the earlier story, also called, believe it or not, Arena. When this was discovered by someone who worked for Kellum DeForest, they reached out to the original author, Frederick Brown, and they paid him for the story rights, which he gladly accepted. If you've never really understood who Kellum DeForest was, don't feel too bad. A lot of people don't really understand his input into Star Trek. So keep an eye open in the future for another video to let you know about this lesser known contributor to Star Trek. Now, a few episodes later in A Taste of Armageddon, and the full name of the Federation was used for the very first time, the United Federation of Planets. In Space Seed, Gene introduced us to the eugenics wars and the augments that started them. This story was so rich in potential that it would inspire a movie sequel in Star Trek The Wrath of Khan almost 20 years later. In addition to the movie, the augments and their use of genetic manipulation would continue to be told and expanded upon significantly by Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Enterprise, and Star Trek Strange New Worlds over the next 50 years. As originally recorded in the book The World of Star Trek by David Gerald, The Devil in the Dark had a strangely unique beginning. Janos Prohaska actually wore the Horta costume into Gene's office one day. Gene looks at it and goes, "Well, that's great. What is it?" And Prohaska says, "I don't know what it is. It can be anything you want." To which Coon replied, "I'll write a script around it." And that he did. In 4 days, he wrote the script for The Devil in the Dark. Now, in Errand of Mercy, we are introduced to the Klingons, a race of warriors that want nothing better than to conquer anybody they meet. The Federation knows this, and they offer to provide protection to a small planet whose residents appear to be in the mid-1600s of Earth's development. What neither side suspects is that our hosts are, in fact, highly evolved beings that only took physical form to interact with our heroes and their enemies. After revealing themselves, they enforce a peace treaty upon the Federation and the Empire. They also reveal that in the future the Klingons and the Federation would be good friends, which did in fact happen just before Star Trek The Next Generation. Now, Star Trek needed a new suite of bad guys. While the Romulans were complex and interesting, they were also very expensive and had time-consuming makeup requirements. So the Klingons were introduced as a far more stereotypical group. The actual notes that still survive today simply describe them as a hard-faced Oriental people. Consider this amazing comparison between John Calicos's core and a famous painting of Attila the Hun. In Metamorphosis, Gene had created yet another character that was so story-rich that he would spawn a movie prequel around the very first meeting between the humans and the Vulcans, as a result of humans developing their very first warp drive. The creator of the drive was Zephram Cochrane. The episode actually fills us in on the fact that he invented the warp drive and then just kind of sailed off into the sunset, never to be seen again until the events of this episode. I do want to point out that Space Seed spawned Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and that Metamorphosis spawned Star Trek First Contact. It is no coincidence, in my opinion, that the two most popular movies released about Star Trek were both based on characters and storylines created by Gene L. Coon decades after his passing. Now, in Bread and Circuses, Gene Coon brought us a prime satirical example of a parallel world, one in which the Roman Empire was still dominant at a point when television existed, which would allow them to televise the gladiatorial combat and then monetize it with sponsors, sort of like what we do here on YouTube today. Like John D.F. Black before him, Coon had become tired and overworked while working on Star Trek. The constant need to rewrite literally every story that came in was simply too much for him to handle. In 2016, his secretary, Andrea Kindred, told Wired that he was relying on amphetamine drugs just to keep going. Added to that was the constant battle that Gene Roddenberry raged at him because Roddenberry believed that the humor that Coon had cultivated in such episodes as The Trouble with Tribbles, I Mud, and a piece of the action was diluting the science fiction that Roddenberry had created. The entire Spock-McCoy dynamic had come about as a direct result of Gene Coon's writing, and Gene had simply taken about as much as he possibly could. So he literally resigned in the middle of a workday, walked out, and never returned. As told by William Shatner in his book Star Trek Memories, one of the last things Gene did do on his way out was to walk up to John Meredith Lucas in the writer's room and say, "Why the hell don't you take over? You produced The Fugitive and Ben Casey and all that shit." With a piece of the action airing last of his episodes, this would be the last time Gene Coon's story and or writing credits would be seen on Star Trek. Now, after leaving Star Trek, he moved to the Universal Studios company and signed a contract to work on It Takes a Thief. Now, while he was under that contract, he is not allowed to write for any other production company. But he had agreed to supply 4 episodes of Star Trek during that 3rd season. In order to do so, he used a pen name, Lee Cronin. Box brain. Well, what can I say? In this case, the less said, the better, right? Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. I have to admit, I watched part of this again as I was preparing this video, and it wasn't quite really as bad as I remembered it being. Maybe not quite as bad as I remember it being. And it gave us one of the very best lines in Star Trek history.
I shouldn't have done it.
What's that?
I should have never reconnected his mouth.
Now, in the wink of an eye, Coon actually managed to slip something past the network censors for the first time. There's a scene here in Kirk's quarters where he is sitting on the side of his bed pulling on his right boot, while she is brushing her hair back into place in front of a mirror. This is the most obvious portrayal of post-sexual activities that has ever been seen in the original Star Trek television series. I'm shocked the censors didn't catch it. And then again, maybe Kirk was just putting his boot back on after taking it off for some other non-sexual reason, and maybe she was just taking a moment to check her hair and makeup in his room because it had the closest available mirror. Yeah, right. Lee Cronin 1, network censors 0. And let that be your last battlefield. This is the last contribution to Star Trek that Gene Coon would ever make. He would be contacted again during the animated series about writing, but he declined the offer. Now, just in case you thought I had miscounted, let's take a moment here to discuss the 13th story that Gene was involved in. Here you can see that original title card from the episode, The Apple. Now, in this case, I have no video clip to show you, because even though he received teleplay credit for the rewrites he did, Gene was never actually listed in the credits of this particular episode. Now, if you thought our little story was over, well, you were wrong. There's a lot more to know about this amazing individual. I would like to spend just a little bit more of your time telling you something that you may have known. In fact, like many of the videos that I've done, this information is readily available, but very few people have ever attempted to tell a story on YouTube about Gene Coon's entire life. My hope is that fans in the future will discover this video, and maybe some of what I go over here may keep his complete story from being lost to time. Now, as you can see from this vintage photo and newspaper clipping from his hometown of Beatrice, Nebraska, Gene Coon joined the U.S. Marines in 1942 and he was there until 1946. And when the Korean War broke out in 1950, he was recalled to active duty until 1952. Now, he would use his experiences as source materials for two novels that he would publish. The first was published in 1962 as general fiction. The last, The Short End of the Stick, would be published 2 years later in 1964, and it dealt more autobiographically. It's also one of the earliest publications ever to discuss the drug problems of the board occupation troops and how the commanders dealt with them. Now, beginning in 1957, he began a long career as a script writer in television shows like Medic. Including Star Trek, he would end up writing for about 60 different television shows between 1957 and 1974. Now, as I had mentioned before, DC Fontana had reached out to Gene Coon and asked him to come to work for the animated series, but he didn't really want to get involved in that again. But even though he declined that offer, he did work with Roddenberry 3 more times as the co-writer of Genesis 2 and the Quester tapes, and then writing the proposal for Spectre. All 3 pilots were not picked up. In early July 1973, Gene went to see a doctor and was diagnosed with stage 4 lung and throat cancer. About a week later, he passed away on July 8, 1973, at the too young age of 49 years. He didn't live to see if the Quester tapes was going to be successful or not. But even more dishearteningly, he passed before Star Trek had actually shown that it was a growing phenomenon and not just another canceled network show. Now, unfortunately, Gene Roddenberry never really chose to acknowledge Gene Coon after Gene died. Roddenberry began perhaps the largest cancel culture movement to ever be seen in Star Trek fandom. Through hundreds of appearances at college lectures and conventions, he added many of the contributions of Coon and others to the Roddenberry legend. I heard one of these lectures myself at the Norfolk Scope in the mid-1970s. However, William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, David Gerald, Bob Justman, Herb Solow, and DC Fontana went out of their way, beginning in the mid-1970s, to make sure they could spread the word of Gene Coon's contribution any chance they got. Unfortunately, even today, 50 years later, there are great numbers of Trek fans that discovered Trek in the 80s or 90s that still have no clue who Gene Coon is and what his accomplishments were. In addition to his TV work, he also wrote movies starring such notable actors as President Ronald Reagan, Lee Marvin, Angie Dickinson, Audie Murphy, James Caan, Orson Welles, Zsa Zsa Gabor, Brian Keith, and Robert Culp.